Today we're talking about different angles to this topic. This first session, we're focusing on climate mobility in national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions. And the reason this is linked to the Data and Knowledge Day is that usually we have to start with some evidence to be able to plan for something. And our approach at the GCCM has been to start with data and knowledge, including local knowledge from communities and stakeholders, to support countries in developing blueprints for action on climate mobility, and then to see how those actions that have been identified both from the data and from the engagement with stakeholders can be integrated into national adaptation plans, nationally determined contributions, and other policy frameworks. In today's discussion, we will hear from countries that already have done this, so they already have some inclusion of climate mobility in their NAPs and NDCs, and also countries that are aspiring to go there. And so we want to compare experiences, identify some of the dynamics that countries are seeing that are important to put into the NAPs. So what are some of the key climate mobility issues that need to be addressed through an adaptation lens? And what are some of the challenges that arise for countries when they are trying to anchor this in their strategies? But also, how concretely can this agenda be moved forward over the coming year? And we're extremely pleased to have with us from Lesotho, the Minister of Finance, Her Excellency Retsilitso Matlanyane. I hope I didn't butcher your name too much. We had the pleasure of having the King of Lesotho with us earlier this year at our Climate Mobility Forum in Berlin. And he gave a very strong message of support to this agenda. So we're really extremely pleased to have you with us, Your Excellency. And I would like to give you the floor for this keynote address.
Well, thank you very much. And a very good morning to everyone. The Honorable Minister of Environment and Ecological Transition, His Excellency El-Haji Abdurrahman Diouf. Okay. The Deputy Managing Director of Global Center for Climate Mobility, and our moderator, Ms. Sarah Rosengardner. Your Excellencies, distinguished panelists, esteemed delegates, allow me to begin first by extending my heartfelt gratitude and appreciation to the Global Center for Climate Mobility for its visionary leadership in convening this vital panel. It is a profound honor to have received the invitation extended to me and my delegation, and to represent the Kingdom of Lesotho in contributing to this global dialogue on climate mobility, data, and literacy, a theme that deeply resonates with our national realities and shared aspirations. Lesotho is a mountainous and climate-sensitive country with its lowest point at 1,400 meters above sea level, and is already experiencing the human consequences of climate change. Droughts, floods, and land degradation are displacing families, disrupting livelihoods, and reshaping patterns of settlements, leaving villages empty. Climate-induced mobility is no longer a distant risk. It is a present and pressing reality, and it is an existential threat that we have to deal with in our everyday lives. This trend that I'm talking about is happening and unfolding throughout the continent of Africa. Africa is increasingly and rapidly becoming a front line for climate-driven mobility, with millions of people forced to relocate due to worsening desertification in other areas, extreme flooding, prolonged droughts, and failed harvests that lead to massive displacement of populations. These pressures are driving rural to urban migration, cross-border movements, and seasonal displacements of people, all of which are reshaping social structures, straining urban infrastructure, and testing the resilience of our nations and the strength of our national institutions. As His Majesty King Lizzie III stated at the Global Mobility Forum in Berlin this past June, climate mobility is not just a statistic. It is a story of disrupted lives, fractured communities, and the urgent need for coordinated action. So, in alignment with this vision, Lesotho has taken bold steps to embed climate mobility into its national frameworks and national development strategies, disaster risk reduction plans, and all climate relevant policy frameworks in all domains and disciplines. These efforts aim to ensure that human climate-induced mobility is addressed comprehensively with a focus on resilience, inclusion, and long-term sustainability. We are actively embedding climate risk management in everything that we do, not just risk management, but also risk adaptation in every policy action that we move with. Our second National Determined Contribution, NDC2, submitted earlier this year, explicitly recognizes human mobility as a cross-cutting issue. It calls for climate responsive planning that addresses displacement, supports affected communities, and strengthens resilience in vulnerable areas and communities. This displacement was reaffirmed by the Honorable Deputy Prime Minister during the Leaders' Summit on 6 November, just here, where she emphasized Lesotho's approach to climate-induced mobility through integrated planning, targeted support for displaced populations, and the creation of economic opportunities in high-risk areas. Our National Adaptation Plan further identifies human mobility as a priority, linking it to food security, access to water and sustainable power, health systems, and education infrastructure. These frameworks reflect our commitment to a whole of society approach, one that views mobility not only as a challenge, but as a catalyst for resilience and inclusive development and forward-looking planning and development strategies. Looking ahead, the NDC3 process, which Lesotho is preparing to undertake, presents a critical opportunity to deepen cross-sectoral coordination, spanning environment, planning, labor, education, health, and social protection. It enables us to build institutional capacity, coherence, strengthen data systems, and ensure climate mobility is addressed in a holistic and forward-looking manner. To translate these commitments into tangible action, we must invest in integrated data systems to monitor climate impacts, to monitor migration trends and vulnerability hotspots. We also need to invest in institutional capacity to mainstream mobility into national and local development planning. We also need to invest in community-based early warning systems and climate information services, while we also need education and intensive literacy programs that empower our citizens with knowledge and tools to adapt. In this regard, we commend the work of International Organization for Migration, IOM, which is actively supporting the Kingdom of Lesotho in addressing climate mobility. Through collaborative initiatives, we are mapping displacement risks, we are developing policy frameworks, and piloting resilience building programs in climate vulnerable districts. However, to sustain the scale of these efforts, Lesotho calls for financial support to complete NDC 3 and to ensure that climate mobility is fully integrated into global climate finance mechanisms, including the Loss and Damage Fund, as well as the Global Goal on Adaptation. Finally, we urge international partners and regional cooperation bodies to help address the cross-border dimensions of climate mobility. This includes harmonizing data standards across countries, sharing best practices, and supporting capacity building efforts in least developed countries. Climate mobility is a defining issue. It's a defining issue of our time, and we need to seriously address this. Let us respond not with fear, but with foresight, not with fragmentation, but solidarity. And if we do this, I believe together we can build a future where mobility is not only a choice, but is also safe, it is dignified, and anchored in resilience. Thank you very much. Obrigado. Ke a leboha. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Matlanyane, for highlighting the progress in Lesotho and the situation there, the importance of national planning, linking up to local planning and capacities, as well as the global discussions here, and making sure that the financing mechanisms and the ways of measuring progress that come from the global level are responsive to the priorities in the national strategies, including climate mobility. And I think that's one strand of work where we see a lot of runway to really make progress in terms of building climate mobility as an area of climate finance. I would love to invite our panelists up on stage. We have 2 colleagues joining us from the Caribbean and 2 colleagues joining us from Africa. And unfortunately, Minister Diouf from Senegal was called into the African Group of Negotiators meeting. So his colleague, Pape Niang, has kindly agreed to join us as a panelist today. So thank you, Pape, for joining us, and please take your seat. We also have with us Mr. Martin Ojok from the Ministry of Water and Environment of Uganda, stepping in for Mr. Bob Natifu, who's in the same situation. And I'm also pleased to have with us our colleagues from the Caribbean, Ms. Colencia Levine, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change of St. Kitts and Nevis, and Mr. Hunter from Dominica. Please take your seats, and I will actually join you on the panel. Here we go. I'll sit down with you. So thank you, colleagues, for being here this morning. I would like to start with the first round of introductions, just around kind of a brief description of how you see climate mobility in your country. Who are the people groups most affected? What are the hotspots areas, so to speak? Maybe you can give us a quick sense of what it looks like in your country. And I'll pass the mic this way and then come to you. Okay.
Is this better? Okay. Louder. Okay. There we go. So, good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to share and be the first. I like being the first. But when we talk about climate mobility in St. Kitts, although you can trace the evidence of this trend in time, and we have examples of hurricanes and reasons to move, the informality of the data presents a challenge. And even though we can relate to having to move, the data is still scattered. In addition to being scattered, the entire country is coastal. And so when you talk about mobility, you're actually talking about having to move the entire country. And when you're talking about moving an entire country, it's no longer just a matter of physical mobility or taking geography into context. You're now talking about intense change management, which is a different intangible thing. And with change management, you have to also now address the root causes for what you see in the data. So in St. Kitts, through the help of the GCCM, we have begun our deep dive. And what we're finding is that Kittitians do not want to move. We're finding that. However, the circumstances that we are realizing is that we have to consider moving. So for mobility, how do we grapple the fact that the data is showing people don't want to move and having to move it's an entire population? So that's what it looks like on the surface. In addition to this, people are living in dangerous areas, guts. And I would have mentioned before that guts are waterways that no longer carry water, but still, when we have climate events, revert to their natural state and then have an effect on the infrastructure. So when you begin to look at this, the cost of having to move now becomes an issue when government has no fiscal space and donors, as we heard yesterday, have a resistance to giving funding to doing things that go contrary to their methodology and their mandates. And so how do you tell people based on the data that even though you have this right to stay, we now have to confront it and we don't have the money right now to do it. And then when we get funds, we now have to consider your right to stay versus our other competing priorities. So in terms of the landscape for St. Kitts, it's very much intangible at this stage, and change management has to be at the fore for us even before we begin to tackle the physical elements related to the topic.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes. 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 Good morning, everyone. Yeah, just in the same vein, I'm Martin from Uganda. Just like the moderator already highlighted. Apologies from the commissioner, Mr. Bob Natif, that would have loved to be with us here, but I'm sharing on his behalf. Just like picking from where my colleague has stopped, we all realize that we're being faced by different challenges caused as a result, which are climate related. For the case of Uganda, we have the different communities. In terms of the natural resources, we have the communities that actually entirely depend on livestock. Okay, so in terms of exhaustion on the natural environment, you'll find them move from one place to another. They are not static or stable, but of course, these are caused or related as a result of climate disasters. Some of the areas actually do not experience the same kind of rainfall that other areas receive. So in terms of the distribution of natural resources, actually other areas are prone to these disasters than others. So you find these different movements which are climate induced are happening. What have we done as a country? With support from the GCCM, we did an analysis where we came up with what they call the climate mobility footprint in in parts of the Uganda, the hotspots areas where the livestock clearings, refugee settlements are actually happening. So this has given us ideas in terms of identifying the gaps and solutions that needs to be done. And this footprint actually has helped us also to do resource mobilization, because as a country we already know what the gaps that exist, and we are able to solicit for finances to actually address these gaps. And moving on to the national actions, or looking at the national processes that we are carrying out as a country in our NDCs and the NAPs. Of course, in the same vein, we've done analysis. There's an analysis report, which with support from the GCCM, that's the Global Climate Center for Mobility, has supported us to do this analysis report, which has actually almost reached to completion. But we've also identified gaps on what to include in our national processes, like the NDC and the NAPs. We are also working with some of the international organizations, like UNHCR. We have the Refugee International. We have IOM. IOM is also leading a process. I know some of the countries here are partners. If you remember the KDMEC, the Kampala Declaration, which has now been extended to be the Africa-wide, including all the 54 countries. So the Kampala Declaration also identifying issues of migration, which are climate-induced, environment-related, but also looking at climate change. So these are already ongoing processes and initiatives which are happening. And as a country, we are taking very keen note of this, and we're making sure that all the issues which are climate-induced, that are causing movements from the different areas and even across border, are being embedded into our national processes. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Idi Nyang. I'm from Senegal, working at the Ministry of Environment. Yeah, I'm working at the Ministry of Environment and Ecological Transition. I'm in this process since a while. So the subject of today is, I think, climate and displacement is cross-cutting when talking to climate change. And even at the national level, in all the sector of development, we can point out some aspects of climate mobility. At the national level in Senegal, we had many accomplishments. First of all, what we realize is in our local government planning, we elaborated a guide, and we insert in the guide climate mobility and displacement. That is the first thing in planning at the local level. Secondly, in our NAPs, we already have developed our NAPs in 3 sectors. One is the fishing sector, secondly in the agriculture sector, and thirdly in the pastoral sector. And we already insert all aspects related to mobility and displacement, climate mobility and displacement, and planning. So now we are going to finalize our NAPs by this COP or just after COP in December. And we know in all sectors that we'll have to plan and to insert the impact of displacement in those aspects. But the most important is we already have many initiatives related to displacement. In the north of the country, we had a project of displacement of population who was living in the coastal area and to be displaced in the inland. That was a project with the UN Habitat. And there is another one with the Canadian University, government and the government of Senegal, the University of Saint Louis. We already displaced people from the coastal area to the inland also. But the impact with people living in the coastal area is very important. And also we are, the advance of the desertification in the north of the country, many people already displaced. They are coming to the capital and trying to find a job because their main activity was the agriculture and pastoralism. And with the adverse effect of climate change, they cannot continue to live in the area and to have their activities. So most of them move from the capital. This is a rural exode to Dakar. They are working there. And when they succeed to have a amount of money, they are migrated to Europe, to US and other countries. So the government tried to work and to put a regulation how to control the flow of migration people. And these are some action that I can identify as action for struggling migration and displacement related to climate change. I thank you.
Good morning. Are you hearing me? Okay, I'm happy. My name is Edgar Hunter, and I'm from the Commonwealth of Dominica, a very small island in the Caribbean, just about 298 square miles. And Dominica happened to be about in the center of the Caribbean. And like all the other Caribbean islands, we are very exposed to the impacts of climate change. As you know, we contribute very little or none at all, and we are highly impacted by climate change. Just recently, in 2017, and that happened to be on my birthday on the 18th of September, Dominica was ravaged by a hurricane called Hurricane Maria. We lost about 225% of our GDP and 80% of our housing stock. And therefore, climate mobility really was an issue for us at that time. For a matter of fact, a number of our people migrated to other islands. Thanks to the other islands, they were open to receiving our people, and a number of our people migrated. But what we have observed is that there is a difficulty to bring them back to the country. So it's imperative that because NAPs, and we are about doing our NAP very soon, because NAP is about building resilience, that is one area we think we must include in our NAP, that how do we deal with mobility and what do we do that when they move out, because the country is so small that a hurricane covers maybe about 3 or 4 islands in the Caribbean one time. Okay? So the country is so small, people cannot escape from the impact. So therefore they must move. So the issue for us is how do you bring back? So you suffer from you brain drain, also you lost a lot of your skilled people. And that kind of retard the progress of the country. I mean, my friend from St. Kitts can tell you that they may be holding about 30 or 40,000 Dominicans. For us, I mean, maybe we have some Antigans there, about 100,000, and the population here now is about 75,000. So climate mobility is a big issue for a small country like Dominica. And so it's imperative that, I mean, our new NAP we're about to do, we do include it. And also it is included a kind of way in our NDC 1.0 and 2.0. But we have realized even more that we are in the process of doing our NDC 3.0. So the intention is to include it even more. Just wanted to know that from the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a bit of a challenge. So if I've been texting, it's to tell my colleagues to please turn up the volume. So sorry, that's why I was distracted. I was trying to get us a little better sound here. Thank you all, and I think we see some commonalities and also regional differences. But obviously, the coastal erosion, coastal impacts are, I think, relevant across different countries. We see the disaster-related displacements. In Uganda, I think the landslides are a big issue and flooding. We hear about the desertification, both from Lesotho and Senegal, and the kind of agricultural livelihoods that are being uprooted. When you look at the NAPs and kind of your adaptation priorities, how do you see this fit into the kind of existing priorities that you have in the country? Where the entry points there? And also, where do you see policy gaps maybe as you look at this? Where do you lack the instruments that would be needed to adequately address this?
So the gap is the lack of policy. That's the gap. And because the issue is so new, and when I say new again, I want to caveat it in that it's not that we don't have the examples, but the data is not formalized. And in discussing the issue of climate mobility, other factors are coming to the front more intensely. One of those is the face of vulnerability. We're not talking about land mass that allows us to focus on one area while preserving another. It's, as Edgar said, the entire population and the neighboring. So the face of vulnerability does not look as we normally do. And we have the emergence of the multidimensional vulnerability index that comes to the front. And we also have this challenge with our ODA status, which makes us ineligible for much of the aid that's out there. And so it's really incumbent on the administration of the time to use these NDC and NAP opportunities to be that vehicle to lead the framework, because we don't have a policy. So for St. Kitts, the priorities, given the gaps, include change management. That's something that has to come to the fore, where we explore why people don't want to move and we try to manage that costing. Institutional coordination is another priority. And at our ministry, we are pushing the development of our National Climate Change Coordination Committee, being thrusted from our ministry to guide that coordination, because the NAP and the NDC does give you that opportunity to engage stakeholders across government. And so if we lead, the propensity for this to become policy is greater. And if we are engaged in all these pockets of society, the likelihood of behavioral change and prioritization across the different themes is more likely. We also want to focus on not just data collection, but a repository, because we are collecting lots of data in many spheres, but then having it in one place towards manipulating it or generalization is an issue. Data visualization and consultation is also a majority issue, because we haven't spoken about it enough to make it a priority in our budget or for our people, but then they also need to see it. It also has to become visual. And clearer frameworks across government needs to also be something that we prioritize. And where the gaps are concerned, culture and heritage is a major blockage to having these themes permeate society. And so we really have to find a way, and in many cases we are, but I'll wait. But in many cases we are, but drilling down on how to have culture become mobile and having the people of a country become conduits of the culture and not that physical space. And as Edgar said, when Dominicans move, how do you bring them back when the place they're coming back to is no longer what they left? And so looking at how you change the conduit of culture is also a gap that we need to focus on, as well as hazard projections. We need to be able to show our people the pathway, what it looks like, the potential danger, as well as what that cross-boundary and territorial movement looks like. They need to see. So we have a responsibility to create those projections for them to make the future possible. And then proactive adaptation and risk mitigation is not something that we engage in. We're responsive. We wait for the hurricane. We know it's coming. We sit and wait. The disaster happens. We wait for aid. And so being more proactive and mitigating in a projectionary manner is something that we need to focus on. And again, I don't want to underplay the importance of that cultural shift and that paradigm attack that we have to engage in towards movement.
Yeah, thank you. For the case of Uganda, I would actually maybe just to, for information purposes, in terms of policies, strategies, and plans, within the region, Uganda is actually the best at making or coming up with these national policies. The challenge or the gaps here is that implementation is something which is lacking. We come up with some of these good policies or existing policies, even addressing the issues of displacement and mobility, but implementation is something which is lacking. So it's one of the areas or a gap that has been identified, and we actually bringing on board the different partners where government cannot support. At least we open up and then we access support from the different partners. Also, the issues of institutional capacity gaps and strengthening, it's a bit affecting us, but we are also trying to have sort of a coordinated processes when we're coming up with these national processes. You know, issues of climate change is cross-cutting, but at least all the different actors, all the key sectors are brought on board. They help in identifying the needs or the gaps that needs to be addressed. The solutions are also embedded in. And also we have the issues of institutional governance. At the end of it all, you note that all these policies, we, of course, require the political heads to, one, do resource mobilization at the higher level, but also enforcement in some of these areas. We've always had issues in terms of the technocrats and then the political heads. When we move ahead to implement some of these policies, some of them actually come as presidential directives. But then the challenge is, if at least that gap is accrued in terms of implementation, it would also help us address these issues. Another gap is maybe just coordination across borders. Like I said, different areas have different challenges. So as a country, I told you, we led the process of the KDMEC, realizing migration is actually sometimes happen across borders. And this declaration is actually trying to bring on board all the different partner steps to help us handle these particular issues. So the key gaps, others exist, but the ones that I mentioned are actually very key or very pertinent in addressing this issue. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So in terms of addressing the gaps, I think at international level first under the convention, we need to have a clear framework that can address climate mobility. So I think under the WIM, the Warsaw International Mechanism, we had COP decision talking about migration and displacement, trans-borders displacement. I was one of the co-chair of the first co-chair of the task force of displacement and migration under the executive committee under the WIM. I think we do not have a clear view and how can I mean, when we was developing the NAP guidelines on climate mobility, I think this need to be correct. I think the guideline for NAPs was updated, and for the next time, I think we need to see how we can insert displacement and mobility in the NAP guidelines, and we're elaborating our guidelines at the national level. This is the first point. Secondly, I think at the national level also, we need to have to develop a strategy and strategic objective for climate and development at the national level. And I think when we are working in our NDCs and our NAPs, there is a lack in terms of when we are planning, we do not have a, a, a view, a clear strategy. How are we going to take into account these aspects of climate displacement and mobility? This is the second point. And thirdly, we need to have to strengthen the institution at the framework at the national level. Maybe we used to have the civil protection minister or the minister of interior or the foreign minister who is taking care of mobility, migration, etc. in our country, but we do not have a specific focus on climate displacement or migration. That will need to be addressed correctly when doing planning at the national level. And I think also we need to get involved all the stakeholders related who related at this thematic at national level. So I think we use only to talk with people who are migrating, but not going deeply discussing and involve the pastor, for example, because in our country, the pastors are migrating or displacing from the north of the country where there is the drought and desertification to the center or the south of the country where we still have raining a lot and having grass for the crops. And many of people who are leaving the village to go to the center, I think we need to get them involved in the process to know what are the needs to address it very, very, very efficiently. So also we need to have a policy coherence and cross-sectorial approach. It needs also to be addressed correctly. How to link with other policies already existed in this field of climate and migration displacement. So, and lastly, capacity building and education need also to be taken into account. I think those points, if we look in our the architecture that we have at the national level, are the gaps that need to be addressed very correctly if we want to have them in our NAPs and have a good policy integration in our NDC. So I think that is the point that I wanted to raise. Thank you.
Okay, in terms of Dominica, post-Maria, Dominica decided that it wanted to be the first climate resilient country of the world. And in order to do this, we came up with a strategy with a lot of national consultation, one called the National Resilience Development Strategy. And out of that strategy, we created a climate resilience recovery plan. All right, and in that plan, a number of areas were covered. One, how we strengthen our infrastructure. So now the government is building a number of houses that we call climate resilient houses. So they have, a lot of them have concrete roofs. A lot of them, the windows can stand hurricanes of up to 200 miles per hour, that kind of stuff. All right. Also, a greater focus on disaster risk management. There's a greater focus on disaster risk management. Also, we recognize after Hurricane Maria, food scarcity was a problem. I mean, again, I mean, if no food, people are going to move. So therefore, we have a greater focus on agriculture, especially on the crops that are going underground, the ground provision, that kind of stuff, because they seem to be more resilient. Because that's what we realized after Hurricane Maria, that a lot of these crops, they survive better than those that go above ground. All right? We also, in terms of our natural resources, it was important that we protect our natural resources. You know how valuable it is to things like tourism. Again, if your natural resources are destroyed, tourism lost, people will move. All right, so the policies basically are in place. So, as we said in NAP, for example, one of the key objectives of the NAP is to build resilience. And seeing that we want to become the first climate resilience country of the world. It's only, therefore, we should include climate mobility, which shows, because if all your people live in it, means you're not resilient. But if when your people leave, you have the mechanisms for them to return, then it means you're resilient. So therefore, even in the NDC, while the NDC is a mitigation document, countries like Dominica have also taken it to be an adaptation document because we make some adaptation statement there, as well as resilience statements. So, NDC, as we said, the NDC 3.0, we're doing we should include climate mobility. And as I said, we recognize it's a major issue. As we say, it's national, it's local, because sometimes we have to move some of our people to shelters. So the post-Maria, the government have built about 8 climate resilient shelters. So you also have to move people from one area to the next sometimes, because our country is very mountainous. And we like to boast of 365 rivers or streams. But during hurricanes, these 365 rivers we boast of, they become dangerous to our people, because a lot of our people live in the river or the basins of the rivers or the sea, even the sea. A lot of people live on the coast. So you know what happens during storms, right? Wave action, that kind of stuff, flooding because of sea. So therefore, sometimes we have to move our people. So we have it nationally, and as we said, regionally, and sometimes even internationally. A lot of people move to the States and England and those places. So therefore, we must find a way, if we want to become resilient, right? And send kids, well, we know send kids, and we love send kids for that. If we want to become resilient, we have to find a way, as we said. They may go, and if send kids is being hit by a storm tomorrow, we'll welcome their people too. But we have to find a way for people to return to their shores. So therefore, that way, I see our mobility should be included in your NDCs and in your NAP.
Thank you. I think we heard the cross-section really of, on the one hand, clearly climate mobility links to the, let's say, more hard adaptation interventions that are needed around water, energy, how do we deal with land sustainability, housing issues, so all the more kind of hard infrastructure questions of adaptation, if you will. And climate mobility links to those, both in terms of protecting the right to stay, right, but also when people move, and often they move to areas that then also face pressures on the infrastructures that exist already. But then I think you also highlight importantly, Colincia, the kind of more intangible dimensions, right, like heritage, cultural dimensions, like what happens to people's attachment to land, what happens to their attachment to their community. If you're asking people to move to a different location in the country even, it could be that they don't speak the same language, right? They don't have the same cultural traditions. And so how do you deal with those types of dislocations that aren't physically, just physical? And as you mentioned, a lot of it, and I think this came from our experiences in our countries so far, is really around like education to some extent with communities, but also I think dialogue and really understanding how do people themselves conceive of this, right? We came up with this terminology of climate mobility because there were so many different terms floating around to describe the fact that people had to move because of climate hazards, because of environmental damages. But we felt like we need one common terminology to start having a common understanding of what this issue is and how it needs to be addressed. But of course, in many countries, communities will have their own language, right? And I think we'll need to bridge between us coming with a new term and not trying to be like, you need to understand us, but more like, how do we understand you and how do we bridge this? Okay, I want to see if we have some questions from the audience before I give our speakers a last round of answers. Yes, we have one. Do I see other hands?
No, thank you very much. Edgar, I really liked your intervention. I was just curious about the Kalinago people and the challenges you face when you are thinking through mobility issues, particularly what you had to deal with post Hurricane Maria. I'm wondering if there are some lessons that we could draw from your experience in dealing with that indigenous group in your country. Yeah?
Very interesting question. And my ministry, I'm part of the Kalinago ministry happen to be part of our ministry. For a matter of fact, my minister is a Kalinago, and he represents the Kalinago people. And he feels very strongly about the indigenous people. Sometimes I wish he was there yesterday. I know if he was, when he saw the protest there, he would have been a member of that protest because he believes strongly in the indigenous people. Okay, so very good question. I mean, the Kalinago people are one of the most vulnerable people. Although they have their own lands, but they are not on the best lands. Their lands are very vulnerable to land slippage. Okay? During Hurricane Maria, they lost about 90-something% of their housing stock. So they were one of the hardest hit. But for whatever reason, the government by policy, and usually when you have Labour government in power in Dominica, they put a lot of emphasis on the indigenous people. And the government, they got a lot of support from the government, and also a lot of the international organizations I found. So they got a lot of support. So in terms of the housing, the World Bank, European Union, they got they were able to rebuild a lot of houses. But the lesson learned from them is that these are resilient people. These are the first people, and they are most resilient people in the Caribbean. They don't move easily. According to my friend from St. Kitts, they don't want to leave their lands. They want to stay and build and build their community. So we have something they call Kudme, I don't know, but what it is, that people come together to build. So someone building a house, they would cook a big pot of food, and everybody else would come and assist. So you have, and we call it Kudme in Creole. So you have that is something we saw among them, that as community, they work very well. But as I say, key is that they were not running. They decided that they wanted to rebuild their community. They wanted to be, so I mean, as usual, some left, but most of them stayed and rebuilding their community. So that's the biggest lesson I learned. The other lesson I learned, that the indigenous knowledge, they have been through it before, because we had a hurricane, I remember, in 1979. I mean, not as bad as Maria, but that caused a number of impacts. And in terms of their housing, the way they build their houses, they understand, that how to build resilience. So they were resilient even before Dominica decided it wanted to be the most resilient country in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have a question from Minister Matlani.
Well, thank you very much. It's really not a question, but maybe to add to the discussion. Am I too close? Really? Okay. Better now? Okay. It's really not a question. It's something that I feel it's missing in the conversation, probably because of the portfolio that I hold, that no one is talking about the cost of this mobility and the cost of the gaps that have been identified. For us, and I think for all of us, this mobility costs countries dearly. You have a population that's moving. You have a population that's really sometimes wiped out, and you have to respond by sometimes replacing infrastructure that was built before, to see that you have infrastructure that is new, that is climate proof and resilient. So I think, as much as we hear the gaps, no policies, lack of implementation, data systems, cultural and heritage changes and everything, what are the costs related to this? We need to be able to cost them, to say how much this is costing our countries and how then we can respond to such costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam. I think this is very, very, very important aspect that we skip when developing and talking about gaps. I think the most important is the cost. I think I already raised 2 projects that we had in Senegal with UN Habitat. Why this project failed, that was not completely finalized, because of the cost was very, very important to displace all and quarter or more than 100 families from the coastal area to the inland zone. And that is very costing and very, very expensive. So even it is only the economic losses, but if you go to the evaluation of the non-economic losses, the cost will be most user important. I think that need to be addressed within the loss and damage, the Warsaw International Framework. I was one of the member of the executive committee, and now I am in the advisory board. And what we are trying to bring to countries is to bring them technical assistance to say how they can evaluate these aspects on migration and displacement, for example. And secondly, how they can evaluate the non-economic losses when people are displaced and the economic losses. That are the key point, that we cannot have an exact evaluation of what will be the cost exact of this displacement. This is first of all. And secondly, when talking to finance for loss and damage and migration and displacement, people they want to bring the insurance in this aspect. And what we don't want, why we don't want to have insurance in, because the biggest company of insurance are in developed countries. When we get them in the process, they will give money by the left side and get it back by the right side with the company of insurance. That we are trying to frame all this in this process before getting them. But the key point, and we cannot have a precise evaluation at what will be the cost if you want to displace people. That is very, very, very challenging for us to have an exact and specific cost of what is this.
Okay, thank you. In summary, our next steps, we already mentioned that some of the analysis have been done in terms of identifying the data gaps. As the country, we have a draft national action plan for in relations to the climate-induced related disaster. But also we formed a committee, and these committees actually have representations across sectors. So these are the ones that are giving us the information to finalize the process of having the national action plan that will give us a picture of what to address in terms of the finances that the honorable ministers talked about. You cannot address something that you don't know the cost. So basically, that is the process which we are doing right now as a country. And hopefully by the end of the year, we're going to have a complete national action plan that is implementable. Thank you.
For St. Kitts and Nevis, what this issue is a confrontation with sovereignty. That's what it really is. Okay. It's a confrontation with sovereignty. And what we're being asked to do is create a situation where Kittitians and Nevisians don't have to move. And if they have to move, they can carry with them what is most important to rebuild something that's St. Kitts and Nevis. So the plan that we have come up with is our Sustainable Island State Agenda. And we have 3 pillars that we think really allow us to explore the mobility paradigm. One of those is sustainable industry, that's pillar 4. And under pillar 4, we really want to drill down on digital transformation where we try to digitize as far as it's possible cultural elements so that when people move and the grid goes back up, you can download or reference many of these intangibles. We also, under this pillar, want to explore more projects like CCAF, where we have an opportunity to cost what adaptation is. In our experience, we only have done it with 4 community groups, demonstrating what moving and rebuilding in an adaptive manner looks like. So more projects like CCAF will lend to that. And we really want to explore using the creative economy as institutional memory conduits and having more of that proliferation. Under sustainability pillar 5, which is sustainable settlements, we really want to explore our NPDP, which is our National Physical Development Plan, which will look at the physical and the infrastructural and try to have building codes and methodology and materials being the focus, as well as land use. And finally, under pillar 7, which is social protection, we really want to look at what temporary and permanent displacement looks like in country, as well as helping Kittitians and divisions deal with migration and what that looks like, because no longer is it a situation where we have to facilitate, but we too may become migrants. And so what that looks like and how do you transfer your identity as you go and how do you carry it? And that relationship within the Caribbean and our partners, where even though we are friendly and we do host each other, are we able to be Kittitians and divisions in Dominica, or will we have to go back home? And then what does that mean for Dominica if we stay? Is it now Dominica Junior because now you have Kittitians there? And really confronting what that reality looks like for us as we grapple with sovereignty. Thank you.
Okay, before I close, Her Excellency, I really, you made a good statement which I am in support of. We haven't mentioned the finance. So when we speak about building resilience, and the struggle to build the resilience is to attract the finance, and not just finance, but low interest rates or grants. And I mean that is why we are in that process now. We are struggling, with all these negotiations because we have been promised finance and we are having difficulty getting that finance. So that is the reason. But in terms of next step for Dominica, one of the issues we need to do the institutional strengthening already for the NAP. We also need to do a sensitization. And I mean, you mentioned something that you have different ministries working in silo. We need to bring all of us to work together to realize that it is a national effort and it's no longer about each ministry and everybody guarding territory. So that is where we are at. And I really want to thank Global Climate Center for Climate Mobility for asking me to join that panel. I mean, I learned a lot from my colleagues, especially you St. Kitts, as a small island developing states. A lot of the information you shared is similar, and I hope not just for the panel, but as small island states, we can share those information and assist each other in the process. Again, thank you, and thank you, audience, for listening to my 10 cents as I become a part of this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think there's many more dimensions to explore. I agree with the minister's statement around the costing of these issues. I think some countries have made efforts around, setting up specific funding vehicles for relocation, for example. But there's a lot of work to be done around the costing. And I think some of you touched also on the cross-border dimension. So both in Africa and in the Caribbean, there are existing frameworks that facilitate cross-border movement. But are they enough to make sure that people who are displaced due to the impacts of climate change can move with dignity and safety? I think that's another topic for another panel. You wanted to come in with your final statement?
It will be very short because I have to join another panel at 11. I'm already late. But I think from our country, the next step is first, we have an initiative with ACME. So we will have an MOU with, and I think it was supposed to be signed here but our minister was not there, and he just joined this week. I don't know if it can be done this week or maybe after we sign the MOU. That is the first thing. And secondly, I know that we have many initiatives at nation level that will be our next step in terms of integrating the NAPs in our, integrating climate mobility in our NAPs. We already finalized our NAPs at the infrastructure and transport and mobility. We already finalized that one, and we have the climate mobility inserted. And the most important is with the African community, I'm not focused on Senegal, to have a regional framework which will take into account climate displacement. Because we know that people are displaced by war, but we cannot have an international recognition of displacement and mobility linked to the climate. That is very important. This is a fight that we need to put on the table to have the international recognition of climate mobility, and then we can have a very strong framework that need to be done here under the convention, not in the Sunday convention. We have the Sunday framework, we have the PDD, the platform of displacement, but it's different from the climate. We are under the climate and the UNFCCC convention, and we need to frame very clearly with clear guidance on the NAPs and the NDCs how to integrate the climate mobility on that document of planning. And I think that if we succeeded, it is a very big milestone that we put on this climate mobility and displacement. I thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. We're looking forward to the cooperation. And thank you, everybody. We'll take a quick picture with everyone. And then, thank you for being with us this morning. We'll wish you a good day.